Skull shining breath. Kapalabhati Pranayama. The pranayama practices discussed up to this point focus mainly on slowing the breath and working on retention. These next few practices are similar to each other with only minor differences, so they are often confused or mislabeled. But all three of these pranayama practices increase the respiration rate, so they have similar physiological effects. We'll dive deep into this first practice and then cover the differences with the other two, bellow breath and breath of fire. Kapalabhati means skull shining breath or skull illuminating breath. It is traditionally used in yoga for cleansing the mind and body and increasing energy levels. The rapid physical activation of the core and compression of the visceral organs may have a positive effect on moving lymph fluid and increasing circulation in the abdominal cavity to help cleanse the abdominal organs, which can help strengthen the immune system and detox the body. Kapalabhati Pranayama is characterized by a forced exhalation with a passive inhalation through the nose. It is easiest to practice this breath in a cross-legged sitting position with the hips situated higher than the knees or in a kneeling position. The active exhalation is very similar to the inward and upward movement of the belly in Uddiyana Bandha, so finding a position that enables this movement with control of the belly is vital to sustain the practice. Our normal resting breath pattern happens in our tidal volume range, with an active inhalation and a passive exhalation. When we inhale, the diaphragm contracts and pulls down to expand the thoracic space and lowers the atmospheric pressure inside the chest. Outside air rushes into the lungs and neutralizes that pressure. When we exhale normally, the diaphragm relaxes and draws up, raising inner thoracic pressure and creating a passive exhalation as we expel air out. Kapalabhati works in the opposite way. We move past the limit of our passive exhalation as we exhale into the area of our expiratory reserve volume, or the part of the lungs that we can access only through forced exhalation. Forced exhalation engages the core and intercostal muscles that contract the torso to the lower atmospheric pressure inside the chest, so that when we relax, the torso naturally expands and the inhalation is passive. As we exhale with this technique, we pull the belly in with a fast, forceful contraction that rapidly forces air out of the lungs. A common mistake is actively inhaling after the forced exhalation and filling the lungs more than intended. A forced exhalation with a passive inhalation moves about 500 to 750 milliliters of air per respiration, or roughly half of our expiratory reserve volume plus a portion of our tidal volume. If we add an active inhalation, we can easily double the amount of air and breathe more than we intend to. Passive inhalation takes practice because it's not a breathing pattern that we are used to. Bhastrika and breath of fire have active inhalations, and I'll discuss why we might choose to do those practices over Kapalabhati next. Kapalabhati is a rapid breathing exercise, with each breath being around a second or less. We are restricted in how fast we can practice because we have to wait for the passive inhalation, which acts as a nice regulator to the speed at which we perform. When you first start to practice this technique, it's good to go slower, with each breath cycle being 1 to 2 seconds, so that you can feel the active exhalation and passive inhalation. You should hear the sound of the exhalation, but not the inhalation. Once you feel comfortable, speed up the breath to a point where you can maintain proper technique and sustain the practice for at least a minute. It's easy to lose the breath and rhythm if you go too fast. You want to make each breath smooth and even with a strong contraction of the core with each exhalation. Kapalabhati Pranayama is a practice of mildly controlled hyperventilation. We see very different physiological effects than we experience with the breath retention and hypoventilation. For example, breathing less increases CO2 in our bloodstream, which raises our blood acidity, enabling better oxygen delivery to the cells via the Bohr effect. As discussed earlier, hemoglobin, the part of the red blood cell that carries oxygen, needs a slightly more acidic environment to release oxygen to the cells. I reiterate this now because most literature about Kapalabhati says the practice increases oxygen to the brain and body, which goes along with the common myth that breathing more means more oxygen. As you've learned, the science says the opposite. Breathing less brings more oxygen to the brain and body. Kapalabhati is a very mild form of hyperventilation that is easy to sustain without feeling lightheaded and dizzy like we usually would from breathing too fast. Because we are moving much less air per respiration, we don't breathe off as much CO2 as if we were taking large breaths, but keep the same breathing rate. The faster breathing still expels CO2 and hydrogen atoms, which makes our blood more alkaline, constricts blood vessels, narrows airways, and stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response or mobilization response. Our blood vessels constrict and our heart rate and blood pressure rise so that more blood can be sent to the extremities to help mobilize us. The upper airways constrict to retain some of the CO2 as we breathe faster, as well as increase the pressure in the lungs to force more air into the velar sacs. As I have said, the autonomic nervous system is not an all or nothing system. Instead, the sympathetic or parasympathetic tone is titrated as needed through the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine and can be controlled by the way we breathe. Kapalabhati is a fantastic practice for stimulating the sympathetic nervous system and creating more rajas energy to motivate us towards achieving our goals and creating focus and purpose. Faster breathing increases our metabolism and burns calories. The forced exhalation is also a really good action for toning the core and developing neuromuscular response from the abdominal muscles to rapidly stabilize the core, which can benefit us in sports and dynamic exercises. The rapid breathing from the Kapalabhati creates a mild deficiency of carbon dioxide. Our drive to breathe comes from two factors: lack of oxygen, which we rarely experience because it's difficult to lower SpO2 unless we hold our breath for a long time, and the buildup of carbon dioxide in our blood. Primarily, it is the increased carbon dioxide levels that urge us to take our next breath. By breathing rapidly, we expel more carbon dioxide than normal and become hypocapnic, which means low carbon dioxide. The deficiency of carbon dioxide enables us to hold our breath for much longer, while carbon dioxide slowly builds back up and urges us to breathe again. Kapalabhati does create hypnocapnia, but because the breathing is more regulated, it is not as effective as Bhastrika Pranayama. However, this is still something we should be aware of as we practice the technique. Note: because of forceful abdominal contractions, you should not do this breathing practice if you are pregnant or have gastrointestinal problems.